Hi everyone, my name is Irina Zabriskie. I'm a writer from San Francisco, and this is a channel Russian Propaganda Explained. I'm going to speak to David Satter about Putin's rise to power, terrorist attacks, cyber war, and the threat that Putin's dictatorship presents to the West. Could you briefly retell the story of the 1999 apartment bombings in Russia, the way they were used for Putin's first presidential campaign, and your role in this investigation?
Well, the 1999 bombings made Putin president, in fact, because the popularity rating of Yeltsin was 2% at the time in 1999, and the popularity rating of Putin, who had just been appointed prime minister, was also 2%. But the bombings, which were blamed on the Chechens, terrified the entire country. And as a result of them, a war was launched in Chechnya. It was the Second Chechen War. Putin was put in charge of that war. The war was pursued successfully, and his popularity soared. Instead of being seen as the corrupt appointee of a corrupt president, he was understood to be the defender of the nation against in the aftermath of a cruel terrorist attack. And the strategy worked. I mean, Putin was elected president as a result of his role in the invasion of Chechnya, the second invasion, the war that was being fought there. The whole situation would have been fairly convincing, except that a fifth bomb was discovered in the basement of a building in Ryazan, southeast of Moscow. And the persons who planted the bomb, which contained an explosive identical to the one that was used in the 4 previous bombings, was the persons who planted the bomb were found to be not Chechen terrorists. They were found to be FSB agents. The FSB announced that, in fact, this had been a training exercise, not an attempt to blow up the building, but everything that took place in Ryazan during the 2 days between the time the bomb was discovered and the moment the terrorists were arrested indicated that this was a genuine terrorist attack and a genuine attempt to blow up the building. The bomb that was deactivated had a live military detonator. People were evacuated from their homes. The entire city of Ryazan was cordoned off. There was nothing about what happened that resembled a training exercise. And the people who were evacuated from their homes and forced to spend the night on the street at no time doubted that what was taking place was a real attempt to blow up a building. But if that was the case, and there was really an attempt to blow up the building in Ryazan, that means that the persons behind it were FSB agents. That means the FSB was also responsible for the 4 previous explosions. And the affair was never thoroughly investigated against the background of fast-changing events. The meaning of the bombings was ignored, and it hasn't been examined since, really. Those who attempted to investigate were killed. Putin became president, and the incident, which is absolutely critical for understanding post-Soviet Russian history, was ignored.
I agree with you. I was there at the time when it was all coming to this culmination. My family was still there, and I was still very much in touch. And I remember the atmosphere in the country. People were terrified. I feel that later on, fear and panic inducing campaigns started to be used as a tool of a so-called hybrid war, later used in other countries. Can you comment on that? Do you think that that was the first time or one of the first times when this strategy was applied and tried?
Well, no, I don't think that the hybrid war and provocations like this are the same thing. I mean, there were other provocations. There was the 2002 theater siege,
Right.
theater on Dubrovka. There was the Beslan school massacre. In the case of both of those incidents, there is evidence that the FSB was actually involved in setting them up. But the hybrid war is a different matter. It's just a method of concealing the participation of Russian forces in a military action. I don't even know why it's called hybrid war. You could call it camouflaged war.
When I studied at Leningrad State University, I was forced to take a military course, combat propaganda, and such clandestine methods were taught to us, demoralizing the population of the enemy. And I feel that later this principle of demoralization was applied to the Russian people as a war against of the government against its own people. Another question I had for you is about the conference PutinCon in New York, 48 hours before Putin's elections of 2018. What is your opinion of this conference, and how would you describe the results? Was it satisfactory to you? Is that what you expected?
Well, it's. I think it was a good idea to have the conference, to have a public discussion of a lot of the things, including the apartment bombings, that need to be discussed. But a conference is an attempt to exchange views and to call attention to certain issues, and we did that. I think that obviously there's a lot more that needs to be done.
I expected to see more coverage in major publications like New York Times or Washington Post, on television, on internet, and there was very little. What do you think about it?
I can't explain it exactly, but it may well be that the New York Times and Washington Post thought that the conference was aimed at the Russian people to some extent. And because we were talking about very serious issues that are not really brought up in the American political dialogue, which is dominated by all the discussion of Trump and collusion and all the accusations that the Russians interfered in our election. We don't have time for things like the apartment bombing or political bombings or political terror or establishment of a dictatorship in Russia, even though those are actually the important issues.
My personal feeling was that the message of the conference was very clear that Putin is a criminal, Russia currently is a mafia state, and it is in a state of a war, unannounced hybrid, if you will, or psychological, or whatever you call it, war that is not acknowledged by the West, and therefore no action is being taken. And multiple speakers brought up various particular measures and steps that need to be taken in order for the Kremlin not to establish their idea of post-Western order in Europe and the United States. This message was completely lost. Do you think it is because the press here micromanaging the daily outburst of events instead of trying to take a moment to think on a bigger scale and see the bigger picture?
They never try to see the bigger picture. The reporters just react to events by and large. And it's the rare person, even among those who consider themselves specialists on Russia, that try to look at the bigger picture.
What is your idea? What is your take on the bigger picture?
Well, I think the bigger picture is that this is a regime that is dedicated to holding on to power at any cost. And they've organized all the affairs of the country and including the country's relationship with the U.S., in order to further that goal, to make sure that they have protected the regime. And they are a danger to their neighbors. They are also a problem for the West, maybe not the grave danger that some people suggest, that they are a problem. But most of all, they're a danger to their own people, because the system that has been created sooner or later will probably face a systemic crisis, a system based on corruption and propaganda and selective terror, but nonetheless allowing an element of freedom and contact with the outside world can't survive forever without a challenge. There's too much injustice, there's too much inefficiency and unfairness. Sooner or later, there will be protests, there will be opposition. And it's in anticipation of that day that Putin and the Russian leadership have mounted this big anti-American campaign, an anti-Western campaign, the better to convince the Russian people that they should support the people who in fact are responsible for the misrule in Russia.
To finalize it, what is, in your opinion, the main threat to the West, and what steps or what measures would you recommend to the Western politicians, expert journalists to face or confront this threat?
Well, there are two threats. One is the possibility of some sort of military action against a NATO ally, for example, the Baltic republics. I don't think that's a very grave threat, but it can't be dismissed either. And so that requires strengthening our deterrence posture and not accepting the Russian view of the world that they can dominate the countries that are on their borders. The other thing is that Russia will attempt to undermine the U.S. and create conflicts in our own society, and we need to have a broader view. And part of what is obligatory, I think, is for us to communicate to Russians and to the world the true history of this regime, including the apartment bombings, but also the other provocations and assassinations and acts of terror. We don't do that. We accept their absurd explanations, repeat them, and then move on. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, that's also part of deterrence, is signaling to the other side, to the people you want to deter, that you know who they are, you understand their psychology and how they operate.
Thank you very much, David, for your time and expertise.
Okay, all the best to you.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to our channel, like the videos, share, and we will be back soon with more interviews and seminars.